director of the SFL webinar series and an executive board member of SFL. We are honored to have Institutional Economics and the Science of Liberty. Before we begin, though, I'd like to take a moment to introduce Students for Liberty and the webinar series. Students for Liberty is a 501c3 nonprofit organization run by students and for students dedicated to liberty. We were formed 3 years ago to serve a previously unfilled niche in our universities, connecting liberty-friendly students with other students, faculty organizations, and resources to help them advance their ideas and applications of classical liberalism. The resources we offer include free books for student groups, a speakers network, protest grants, handbooks on running a student organization, tabling kits, leadership training, an academic journal for liberty and society, and our bread and butter conferences. The SFL webinar series is a way of giving you access to the idea and mentorship and liberty year-round from wherever you are. We hold webinars each week to put you in touch with the top mentors and scholars for liberty in the country. For a full list, please visit our website, studentsforliberty.org. Now, I am pleased to introduce our speaker this evening. Peter Boettke is the Deputy Director of the James M. Buchanan Center for Political Economy, a Senior Research Fellow at the Mercatus Center, and Professor in the Economics Department at George Mason University. Professor Boettke was born and raised in New Jersey. He received his BA in Economics from Grove City College and his PhD in Economics from George Mason University. Before joining the faculty at George Mason University in 1998, he held faculty positions at Oakland University, Manhattan College, and New York University. In addition, Professor Boettke was a National Fellow at the Hoover Institute for War, Revolution, and Peace at Stanford University during the 1992-1993 academic year. He has been a visiting professor and scholar at the Russian Academy of Sciences in Moscow, the Max Planck Institute for Research into Economic Systems in Germany, the Stockholm School of Economics, Central European University in Prague, and Charles University in Prague. Just to note, there will be 15 minutes of Q&A at the end of the webinar. Feel free to type in any questions into the question box. For those interested, the webinar will be recorded and archived on our website in the next few weeks. We will be sending you more detailed information about Students for Liberty and the Liberty Movement in our follow-up email. Without further ado, I present to you Professor Peter Boettke.
Thanks, Leah. This is I'm fascinated to speak to Students for Liberty. I've done only one other webinar like this for a different group, so it's a little awkward format for me because I'm speaking but I don't see an audience, so I don't know whether or not I'm able to resonate with the audience. So do me a favor and ask questions as we go along as well. I guess there's no one interrupting and raising their hand sort of metaphorically in here and doing this, but try to type your questions, I guess, and do that. I agreed to talk tonight on the topic of Austrian economics, institutional economics, and the science of liberty. What I want to sort of try to do is explain the interconnection between these various different things, and mainly with a focus on the science of liberty in the end. What is it that we're trying to do when we take studying liberty seriously, when we take the idea of developing a research program in classical liberal or libertarian scholarship and you do it seriously. Okay, so the first thing that I want to state is that we have a kind of a normative vision. This is one that I think that I would share with almost everyone here probably in this audience, which is one of a society of free and responsible individuals who participate and have the opportunity to perhaps prosper in a market economy based on profit and loss, and who can live in and be actively engaged in caring communities. So we're not talking about an idea in which, you know, the philosophy can be summed up simply in some notion of atomism, in which you know, we just want to have complete and sort of autonomy from everyone else in the society. No, we're trying to figure out how it is that we can all come to live better together and to realize the tremendous gains from social interaction that way. Another way to think about this, and it's a way that Jim Buchanan has summarized this. Jim Buchanan, for the people who don't know, is the Nobel Prize winner for the development of the field of public choice. In 1986, he was my professor. When I went away from George Mason, I was gone for 10 years. And when I came back, part of the reason for coming back here was the ability to work in what Leah mentioned before as the Buchanan Center and to take over aspects of Professor Buchanan's classes. I teach his course on constitutional political economy that he taught. And he has a wonderful essay. It's not the most eloquently titled of his essays. Usually he's the master of titles: The Calculus of Consent, The Limits of Liberty, The Reason of Rules. These are Democracy in Deficit. So he's a master of titles. But this essay is called The Potential and Limits of Socially Organized Humankind. So it's not exactly, rolls off the tip of your tongue. But he put a challenge to all of us. This is to all of the students of liberty types and scholars of liberty. He said, listen, he said, the great Scottish Enlightenment figures in the development of political economy had demonstrated to us how you can achieve, society can achieve simultaneously maximum individual autonomy, generalized prosperity, and peaceful social order. But ironically, Buchanan puts the challenge, it's precisely at the point when the empirical evidence was strong that the classical liberal position had in fact realized those things in practice, that the moral worth of the classical liberal position came under its strongest criticism. And that is his theory of justice and whether or not capitalism was a just social order or whether or not it was morally legitimate. So what I want to suggest again is that if you think in those terms, what we're arguing, classical liberals are arguing, is that the sort of the liberal order, it gives individuals rights, generalized prosperity, and a peaceful social order that has moral worth. So challenging the idea that rather than that we're morally bankrupt, it's actually this claim that the society of a free and responsible individuals is a society that has moral worth. It's in that society that individuals can have a flourishing human life, and that flourishing human life is a condition, is something to be desired and valued. So think about that. Let's break that down, right? So we have individual autonomy and the maximization of the respect and appreciation of individual rights, generalized prosperity, and peaceful social existence. So if you think about the ways in which various different libertarian writers have tried to justify things, a lot of times we talk in terms of rights speak, endowed by our Creator with inalienable rights, or we derive, rights from mixing our labor, sort of the natural rights kind of position. And then on the other hand, you also have the economic argument, which is about generalized prosperity, freedom of trade, freedom of association. These are the things that enable individuals to realize the gains from cooperation and realize sort of economic development. Murray Rothbard, great sort of Austrian and libertarian economist, he used to argue that it was a happy coincidence that you were able to get both of those things. I want to sort of embrace that happy coincidence idea and again go back to the Buchanan idea of simultaneously achieving individual autonomy, generalized prosperity, and peace. And that this order has moral worth precisely because it does those things. So now, if that's what our normative vision is, and we want to see, where out there in the world these things happen, and what are the preconditions that allow us to realize that, one of the things that we do is we engage in a intellectual exercise of what I'm going to call comparative historical political economy. This is not anything new. It's the same way Adam Smith did his economics. It's the way that Ludwig von Mises does his economics. It's the way that F.A. Hayek does his economics. It's sort of the way Milton Friedman did economics. I'm emphasizing the commonalities here, not the differences. And comparative historical political economy. Louder? Okay, sorry. Sorry, I was just told that I'm speaking too softly. That's very rare that someone says that to me. Can you hear me now better? I don't know. I probably was speaking down to my feet. Let's see here. I see, yeah, this is my, hello? Is that better? Is that better? Okay, I guess that the staff here is going to try to fix my computer and make it better. I'm going to try to keep talking. So, all right, I'm getting out of the way. But what I was saying is that in order for us to be able to examine, you just lost me.
Yep, that's okay. You can continue talking.
Okay.
Sorry.
That's okay. Let me get out of your way. How's that? Is that better?
No, you're fine.
All right. So I was saying that what we need to focus on is the issue of comparative historical political economy, and that this is the way in which economists have always sort of done their economics. If you go back to Adam Smith, he engaged in exercises of contrast. If you look at Mises, you have exercises in contrast, interventionism, socialism, and liberalism in Mises' three systems. There you go. Line it up. That's it.
Okay.
It picked up a lot now.
There we go.
Okay, thank you.
And then if you want, you can make that completely.
The whole screen?
Yeah.
Okay, so
Let's see.
no, there.
Just make it just
Hold
as
on.
big as you want.
Trying to make me bigger. Not that I need a bigger head. There you go. Now, okay. Is this good? All right. So it's an exercise in contrast between economic systems. This is the best way how we try to learn how to understand the science of liberty is an exercise in contrast. And so the core question goes all the way back to Adam Smith. Why are some nations rich and other nations poor? Why are some institutional arrangements more conducive to human flourishing rather than others? The way that I like to try to say this to students a lot of times is that mankind has exhibited throughout its history two natural proclivities. We have the proclivity to truck, barter, and exchange, what Adam Smith had identified, but we also have the ability to rape, pillage, and plunder, which is what Thomas Hobbes has identified in mankind. And the question of whether or not we engage in truck, barter, and exchange, or rape, pillage, and plunder is going to be a function of the rules of the game under which we find ourselves interacting. For most of human history, we have found ourselves in an environment in which the rape, pillage, and plunder behavior was actually more rewarded than the truck, barter, and exchange behavior. But modernity, right, the modern economic growth, is an environment in which we have existed under institutions which in fact have rewarded our truck, barter, and exchange side. And so the countries that are rich are the ones that pursue truck, barter, and exchange. Taking is only possible if you also offer giving. It's not just a take society. It's takings as always has a corresponding giving going with it. Whereas the poor societies are the ones in which violence and the rape, pillage, and plunder sort of behavior is still the dominant one. Those are the ones that sort of languish in poverty. So if you want to look at why it is that some nations are rich and other nations are poor, we find the answer to that in the institutional environment that people find themselves. Well, this brings us then to an empirical component. So that's the first part about comparative institutions. The second part is historical analysis. We cannot answer empirical questions with philosophy. All right, this is a point that Deirdre McCloskey has emphasized in her recent works on the bourgeois virtues and bourgeois dignity. You can't answer questions about how societies were operated in the past just based on philosophical argument. What you need to do is you need to actually dig in and find out what the empirical information is, what the historical record is. What does it mean to realize the gains from social cooperation and the division of labor? What are the empirical components of that? Classic example of this is when people try to make arguments about that, well, we used to have a communal order, which was smaller societies, more more harmonious societies that existed in the past. And what McCloskey points out is that these kind of small communities that were very poor, they actually weren't very desirable to live in. There was tremendous amounts of murder in these small communities. There was a lot of violence, arbitrariness. You lived under a world in which politics, when there was politics, actually was one of dominion and discrimination, not of general rules and social order. So we need to sort of become very historical. And the third thing is, so think about my point, comparative. So we engage in exercises of contrast. Historical, so we actually look at the historical record and get deep into the history. And then the third part is political economy. Now, why political economy? Why not just economics? And the reason for that is that economic life is always embedded inside of political and legal sets of institutions and social and cultural sets of institutions and values. When we want to understand the embedded nature of human life is not acontextual. It's always within the context, all right, of a set of rules that we interact by, that is defined both by our quote-unquote political and legal system, but more fundamentally by our social and cultural system. So imagine a Venn diagram with 3 different circles, okay, one of them being economics and finance, another one being social and cultural, the other one being political and legal. The intersection of that circle, that's where the glue that holds society together. It's in that glue that we're going to find out how we come to live better together. And so that's the exercise of comparative historical political economy. What we want to do as analysts of that is we want to take examples which it's least likely that we would end up by getting social cooperation on division of labor. That is most likely to spur on cheaters and defectors from the social order. And then we want to see what mechanisms arise that discipline the cheaters and the defectors such that we can realize cooperation. We want a set of institutions which treat men not as if they're at their best, but instead as if they're at their worst, but somehow the institutions funnel them in a direction that allows them to realize these gains from trade. Those are the kind of cases we want to identify. So that's the big sort of comparative historical, and I think if you look at like Adam Smith's inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations, you'll see that kind of contrast. He's contrasting in there not only the mercantilist system with the emerging sort of free trade system that he envisions in economics, but it's also the case that he's contrasting the physiocrat system with the mercantilist on the level of ideas. And so it's always an exercise in contrast, okay? Again, you know, going from Adam Smith to more a more historical figure, but early 20th century is, think about Ludwig von Mises's work during the 1920s. He wrote a book called Socialism, demonstrating the failures of the socialist order. He wrote a book on liberalism, which is how it is that the classical liberal system would work and why it can do what socialism couldn't do. And then he had a book on interventionism, which explains what happens when you intervene or attempt to intervene in the liberal order and how that generates instability. It's a comparative historical exercise. That's what we're engaged in. And we want to understand those institutions in practice. Now, so this brings us to another way to think about this analytically. All right, I'm building up, by the way, to sort of describing sort of a research program, but I want to sort of lay these ideas out for you, which is another way to think about this analytically is to think about the development of ideas from Adam Smith to F.A. Hayek with regard to the spontaneous order of the market. And one of the things that you sort of examine when you think about that, when you study economics, is you begin with 2 primordial facts of the world. When we look out the window, I have the window here, I look out the window into the world, not on the blackboard to study how other economists, but out there in the world, and I sort of look around, what's the first two things that I see? The first thing that I see is that individuals will pursue their own self-interest. That is, that they engage in rational choices. They will try to do the best that they can given their circumstances. That doesn't mean that they wouldn't engage in ex post regret. All right, all the time we walk around saying, "Oh, I should have had a V8." Okay, but that doesn't mean that before we acted, we didn't think we were doing the best thing that we possibly could do. Right now, many of you are probably thinking, "God, I should have had a V8 and could be watching something else on TV rather than listening to this guy talk." All right, but before you turned on that button, you thought the utility that you would gain by watching or listening to this lecture would outweigh the utility that you would gain from some alternative path, and so that's why you made that choice. All right, so you're going to try to pursue your actions, your purposes in the best way that you possibly can. Okay. The second thing that we notice when we look out the window is that, especially in a modern society, Paris gets fed. All right, I go to the stores and there's stocks of goods and services up on the store. I go to the grocery store and there's any kind of fruit or whatever that I want to get, or I go to the liquor store and I'm going to be able to see the liquor. I go to the butcher and I'm going to be able to do that. All right, so one of the things that we see is that actually people are in fact generating a social order that they can get the things that they want to get. The issue is that the economist has to explain how you go from one to the other. All right, and not by collapsing them. So you don't collapse it just so that it's one actor choosing, okay? So it's not that you collapse one to the other. It's also not that we deny it, okay? There's no order around and people are stupid or whatever. The puzzle that we're doing is how do you go from rational choices to a beneficent social order? And the way in which you translate that move in economics is through institutional analysis. It's through the institutional analysis of private property, free pricing, and profit and loss accounting that we're able to transform individual pursuit of self-interest into a socially beneficent outcome. Adam Smith never argued that individuals pursuing their own self-interest, no matter what institutional environment they find themselves in, will generate a socially beneficent outcome. And again, going back to the comparative thing, Smith compares the teaching in Edinburgh with the teaching in Oxford. And one of the big differences in the institutional environment is that in Edinburgh, the students had to pay direct fees to the faculty, whereas in Oxford, they were paid a fixed salary without any concern for what the students did. Now, you guys are sitting there, just think about it. Which one do you think Smith argued led to better teaching, better professors? All right, in both environments, in Edinburgh and in Oxford, the professors were pursuing their self-interest. But in Oxford, their pursuit of their self-interest was at odds with the socially beneficent outcome of improving education among the students. But in Edinburgh, by channeling and funneling individual effort in a certain direction, that is that I could only pursue my interest and realize my benefits by servicing others, I was able to actually use the forces of competition and the incentives in the market to be able to produce a beneficent social order. So, but the key thing is that rational choice and social order are the two facts that we need to explain by way of how do I derive, well, what I need to explain is how I derive from the one, the other, and the way I do that is through examining institutional analysis. Another way to think about this is Robert Nozick's discussion of invisible hand explanations in Anarchy, State, and Utopia. In Anarchy, State, and Utopia, Nozick around in the first chapter, their second chapter, has a whole discussion about invisible hand explanations. And if you go and look at that discussion, you'll see 2 pages of examples that he gives. And those examples are the classic examples that all of you as students of liberty have been exposed to already. The powerful incentives of private property rights, the knowledge conveyance function of the price system, the failure of socialism because the inability to engage in economic calculation, and the failure of manipulation of money and credit through the boom and bust cycle of the business cycle. Okay, all of those things are examples that Nozick gives, plus others. All right, but those are canonical cases that Nozick gives of invisible hand explanations. So if you look at that and think about what I'm arguing, you'll see the connection, I hope. So in the way in which Nozick sort of explains the method of which we do things, and what I'm trying to say is that what Nozick calls the invisible hand explanations and what I might have called earlier spontaneous order analysis, that is the analysis that's consistent with the science of liberty. That's the analytics that you guys have to learn in order to become well-informed, intellectuals of the liberal order. And it's an important point, I mean, about learning and becoming serious about things. I think it's fantastic what the Students for Liberty is doing now and whatnot, and with these kind of vehicles of this modern technology and the blogging and the way you're all networked with one another. But there's no substitute for sitting down and really studying hard and thinking through these issues and reading these kind of things. And one of the sort of great things in Nozick is going through all of those different examples and learning. Bastiat, a great French liberal, said that the worst thing that could happen to a good cause is not to be artfully criticized, but to be ineptly defended. And so the charge that has fallen upon you guys is that it's incumbent upon you to learn how to become the best defenders and most open-minded and intellectually challenging thinkers about the liberal order. Don't shy away from that. So anyway, going back to Nozick, Nozick's Anarchy, State, and Utopia, in this, the way he describes it is you begin with an individual that has purposes and plans. You throw that individual into alternative institutional filters, and that individual and then those individual institutional filters will spit out an equilibrium tendency. This is how we do invisible hand stories. All right, so note again how that's comparative analysis, right? Because what we're looking at is how alternative institutional arrangements will in fact structure the incentives and influence the flow of information and quality of information that actors use that will generate tendencies that come out of the process, the equilibrium tendencies. So to give you an example, think about the difference between politics and the market. In both situations, individuals are in fact self-motivated, right? They're self-interested. In both situations, they're purposeful, whichever way you want to go at this, okay? In one environment, property prices and profit loss, you throw that into that environment, and they are given incentives, information, and the spur of innovation, all right, and the feedback that's associated with all of that. Well, now how about when we throw them into the politics environment? What is the analogous feedback loops and to property prices and profit and loss? That's how you have to think about this. So what are those things like the vote motive, right? The incumbency rates, right? Election, re-election, that kind of stuff. You know, what are the things there? What is the natural biases in the system? So if the market tries to tend towards pushing, to cost minimization, what is it that gets pushed in the political arena, right? That's the question that you have to ask yourself. All right. All right. So some of this stuff should seem really basic to you guys so far, and now we get to a point. I'm sure that some of you are out there are studying economics right now and in school or thinking about going to graduate school or whatever. And so what I want to talk about now is economics historically contemplated. And I want to make a distinction, or want you to think about a distinction between mainline economics and mainstream economics. Because you hear a lot of times about, oh, well, that's not part of the mainstream, okay, or whatever. I think most of the time people that say stuff like that are confused. For example, I've never had any difficulty talking to other people in economics. That doesn't mean that people in economics tend to like me or not like me. They might think I'm silly or whatever, but they also think that about one another as well. It's just the nature of any kind of scientific inquiry. But the idea that like Austrian economics is not mainstream and therefore you can't get a hearing. I think it's just false. Leah had mentioned when she was introducing me, I taught at NYU for 8 years. I was a fellow at Stanford for a year. I've been a visiting professor twice at the LSE. I referee journal articles. I edit a series with Cambridge University Press. It's just not the case that people don't pay attention. They think I'm crazy, right? I believe that we don't need a state to have social order and to have a modern, prosperous society. I don't think we need a state to do that. And I think there's institutions that can arise alternatively to the state to provide self-governance. That's a kind of a radical position. I think most of what we currently have in our current economic system is illegitimate, based on bad economics and threatens the future of our economy. So I have an extremely staked out position, right? But it's not that I can't get a hearing. It's just that I have difficulty, just like everyone else, in communicating with my peers. So the main line of economics is different from the mainstream. And that's what I think is important, is that the main line are those who sit in the seat of Adam Smith. That is, you can trace their ideas in a lineage all the way back through to Adam Smith. Adam Smith to Jean-Baptiste Say and Bastiat, upwards to, Menger and Mises and Hayek, forward to Jim Buchanan. All right, these are all sort of this kind of idea. What unites all these thinkers? It's positive propositions about the economy. How does an economic system operate? What are the economic forces at work out there in the world? All right, how the world works. It's a positive analysis of how the world works that comes all the way back from Adam Smith all the way up to Vernon Smith, let's say. Mainstream economics is those who hold, it's a sociological concept. It's not about positive propositions about the economy. It's simply those who hold the prestigious positions at any moment in time. Sometimes the mainstream is the main line. Sometimes in our history, the most prestigious positions were held by those who believed and articulated the main line of economics. But at other points in time, that's not true. All right? People can, in fact, be very adamantly rejecting the main line of economic teachings, but they can, in fact, be very prestigious people, teach at the highest schools, things like that. So what is mainstream? Mainstream is a methodological agreement on how you should study economics. All right? So I think the first thing that you have to get across in thinking about this when reading economics is that there's positive propositions about the economy that could be stated in many different ways. Right? In the old days, when we only spoke in natural language with one another, there were mainline economists who spoke in French, mainline economists who spoke in German, mainline economists who spoke in English, right? Mainline economists who spoke in Italian, all right? Mainline economists who spoke in Swedish, right? Now, right, rather than that, we all speak the same language called mathematics. But we have different propositions, right? So the propositions disappeared and the methodology came forward. Now, why does this become an important thing? As mainstream economics came to be defined by formalism and positivism, the sort of institutional analysis which I labored to get across to you before, that was in fact the hallmark of classical political economy, gets lost. And then by the time we get to the mid-20th century, economic theorists describe themselves as trying to develop, and this is a direct quote, institutionally antiseptic theories. Theories that had no reference to institutions. In fact, for many of you, you'll find this somewhat shocking, in debates in economics, some of the crucial debates, incentives were in fact viewed as out of bounds. When you think about economics today and you read like a great book like Bill Easterly's The Elusive Quest for Growth, what's the main message? When it boils all down, what's the main message? Incentives matter. Incentives matter. He goes through all the different examples of efforts to try to use Western aid to help poor countries, and he keeps on coming back to that core idea, incentives matter. All right? Why does he have to keep emphasizing that? Think about that. That's something you learn when you take Econ 100 for the first time. Why is Bill Easterly having to repeat that over and over again in a book designed for his peers? It's precisely because economics went through a period of time where they tried to push incentives out of the economics, and that's because they pushed institutions out of economics. If incentives were viewed as out of bounds, for example, it was a violation of the value freedom stricture. Oscar Lange, in his debate with Mises and Hayek over socialism, in his original essay, he comes to the point about the incentives that are generated by bureaucratization. And he says explicitly, these are not questions of economics, they're questions of psychology. So let's leave them for the psychologists and let's not have the economists deal with them. When Ava Lerner writes his book called The Economics of Control, when Milton Friedman reviews that book in the JPE, you can get it in Friedman's essays called Essays on Positive Economics. When Friedman reviews that book, he says the problem with Lerner is not that he made any logical errors. It's as if he does, but the problem is that he does political economy as if it's done inside of a vacuum. Public administration is done as if it's inside of a vacuum. This, of course, was a huge mistake. The other thing that's going on in the institutionally antiseptic theory is that information is viewed as costless. Now, so we thought that economics was trying to tell us that the only way the market could work is information was perfect. And since market participants didn't have perfect information, what we could do is we could then have government officials take over and do better than the market participants. So what happens is we have an identifying of the failed market, but we have a asymmetry in the assumptions with regard to politics. And so we ended up by turning the imperfect market over to the perfect government. So that's how the debate evolved by the time we get to the 1950s and 1960s. You have an imperfect market, perfect government, and government is going to serve as a corrective to the market ills. And therefore, that's why economics becomes a tool for the government to be used. In the 1970s, excuse me, this is actually reprinted in the 1970s, but the essay originally was written in the 1960s. Jim Buchanan announces that the emperor has no clothes, that this development of economics, all this highfalutin development of economics, actually has no clothes. And he has a great line which I want to read to you. It's 3 sentences. He says, "If not an economist, what am I? An outdated freak whose functional role in the general scheme of things has passed into history? Perhaps I should accept that assessment, retire gracefully, and with alcoholic breath hold my cabbages. Perhaps I could do so if the modern technicians had indeed produced better economic mousetraps. Instead of evidence of progress, however, I see a continuing erosion of the intellectual and social capital that was accumulated by political economy in its finest hours." What Jim Buchanan did from his perch first in Blacksburg and first in Charlottesville and in Blacksburg and then eventually at George Mason University was to lead a rebirth in the field of political economy, the kind of questions that I was talking to you about before. But Jim Buchanan's not the only one. By the 1950s, 1960s, there started to be a counter-revolution in economics. By the way, for the students that are there that are really interested in Austrian economics, this is one of the great things about Murray Rothbard's Man, Economy, and State. If you read Murray Rothbard's Man, Economy, and State, you should read the footnotes as well as the book. The footnotes, that book is a massive tome. It's very well written, and it has footnotes that are very, very rich. And what Rothbard does is he basically, that book's published in 1962, he basically summarizes all of the literature in market-oriented economics that had developed in the 1950s to the 1960s. And it's all embedded in that, in those footnotes, in addition to the development of the Austrian tradition. Rothbard, in that sense, is developing the main line of economics, the positive proposition about the value of the free market economy versus the hampered market economy and government prohibitions. And so I highly recommend all of that. Again, I'm going to emphasize today the commonalities with all these groups, not the differences. There's plenty of time to talk about the differences, and maybe you can raise some of those questions. But the counter-revolution in economics between 1950 and 2000 was one in which you, first and foremost, I would mention the Public Choice and Constitutional Political Economy group. This is exactly the thing that I was just talking about with Buchanan and Tulloch. The core idea of that is the first one is the demand for symmetry of assumptions. If you're going to assume that market participants are imperfectly informed and operate in imperfect structures, then when you go and look at politics, you can't assume that the political system is filled with perfect knowledge and perfect structures. Whatever assumptions you make in the one arena, make in the other arena, all right, and then look at the examination of the institutional differences on the feedback, okay? The best way to communicate this is what's called the tale of the Roman emperor. An emperor is asked to judge a singing contest between two contestants, and upon hearing the first, gives the award to the second under the assumption that clearly the second couldn't be any worse than the first. What's wrong with that? Well, it could be that the first singer sings and sings like la 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 la, not very good, and so you listen and you're like, oh, but the second singer might have sung and he went like that, even much worse. So, but if you don't let that second singer sing, you have no idea. So the analogy here was, yes, you might look at the market, and the market might not be perfect. But let's look at the costs and benefits associated with getting government in there. It might turn out that the cure is worse than the disease. And so that was the first thing about public choice that had to get across. Besides the consistent and persistent application of the sort of praxeological method, all right, which is both the purposiveness of the actors, all right, and then what you have is the compositive method of the outcome, all right, so the praxeological approach to these things, all right, which is what Buchanan and Tulloch actually explicitly say that they're following. Besides that, there's also the symmetry of the assumptions and the emphasis on the alternative institutional arrangements. That alternative institutional arrangements, the way they capture it, is an emphasis on what they call rules of the game and strategies within the rules. So there's two levels of analysis. There's an analysis over the rules, and then there's an analysis of the strategies within the rules. So the public choice revolution starts, and that starts in the 1950s with the work of Jim Buchanan and then eventually with Gordon Tulloch. Property rights economics, which is most identified with Armin Alchian and Harold Demsetz. And what they focused on, right, was sort of the incentives as a function of the rules of, the rules that determine who owns what and what they can do with it. Now, the easiest way to think about this is that property rights come in two different forms, a right to control an asset and a right to cash flow of the asset. What are the incentives when you have control rights and cash flow rights? What are the incentives when you have control rights but no cash flow rights? Right? What does that affect in the decision making? Are we going to, in fact, husband resources effectively, or are we going to, consume those resources very quickly? All right. All those incentive effects on our behavior that property rights and different property rights rules play for us, that became a part of economics that had to be captured again. Law and economics, which is associated with Ronald Coase, and then eventually with Richard Posner. The law and economics said, okay, look, the legal environment has an impact on economic performance. The first thing is a critique of the Pigovian remedies. The idea that if you, this is after Arthur Pugot, who argued that when you have a positive externality, what you need to do is subsidize the behavior. When you have a negative externality, you need to tax the behavior. And externality is a spillover effect on other people's things. So the whole point was to bring the private marginal benefits, marginal costs in line with the social marginal benefits and marginal costs. And we could use taxes and subsidies in order to do that. Okay? What Coase pointed out was very simple. He said either in a zero transaction cost world, economic actors would already have negotiated away the conflicts, or, right, in a positive transaction cost world, all right, the government couldn't set the appropriate price, right? So it's either that the solution is either redundant or non-operational. That's Coase's criticism. And so instead what you do is you sort of follow the Coasean rule, which is to negotiate away conflicts, adjudicate the property rights, to clarify the rights, to help ease the negotiation, not the legislation aspects of things. In addition to law and economics, there was also development of new economic history. This is with Douglas North. and the institutions and relative price effects and how that helps us understand transformations through time. So one of the easiest ones to think about is what happened to labor markets in Europe when the Black Plague hit. You have a huge shock to the labor supply. What does that mean for people to be able to do that? That's how you got free labor, right? It changed the relative price on labor, and as a result, you had to change that institutions that govern the way the labor market was operated. Then you have economics of governance, which is in Oliver Williamson, which is the internal organization of firms, or Eleanor Ostrom, which is about the sort of organization of common pool resources. Again, the focus there is on the rules and enforcement. And in Williamson's idea, the idea is how is it that you develop rules which discipline opportunism with guile, right? Opportunistic behavior among economic actors, shirking type behavior. And in Ostrom's work, it's how is it that the rules do the following thing. They limit access, assign accountability, and introduce graduated penalties for the violators. All right, and all of that's done through the evolution of institutions. And then finally, the Austrian component, okay, on the focus of entrepreneurship and the market process and discovery and adaptation to change. Okay, so, and this is the Kerzner, the sort of Mises, Hayek, and Kerzner position. The reason why I'm emphasizing all of these different things is, think about this, Austrian economics, institutional economics, and the science of liberty. It was precisely because in the 20th century we had the development of Keynesian economics, macroeconomics, which was not rooted in the behavior of any individual's choices, but instead these more macroeconomic variables. But we also had development of market failure theory on the microeconomics grounds. And so what happened in the post-1950 period was you needed to have a recapturing of a lot of the insights which someone like Adam Smith and Jean-Baptiste Dessay and John Stuart Mill, had a century before. In the way in which we develop these things, what we get is a political economy, which you'll see if you get the slides for this. I want to locate that in the side which is a blending of the traditions of the Austrian school with Eleanor Ostrom and Vincent Ostrom's work of the School of Institutional Analysis of Development at Bloomington, and then the Virginia School of Political Economy. The normal political economy blending is Chicago price theory, University of Rochester voting models, and Virginia political economy. I'm suggesting that there's an alternative way to look at things which is more consistent with dealing with ideology and ideas and belief systems and whatnot, and more open-ended notions of choice. So let me push forward why that framework is. I'm going to try to finish up, and I have 2 more slides, and so then I'll finish up. So avoiding closed-ended and single-exit theories. So I said before that we're trying to do rational choice theory, but it's rational choice theory as if the choosers are human. For all of you who are out there, I suggest that you get a hold of the copy of Human Action by Ludwig von Mises and read the first 100 pages. It's probably the most important 100 pages you'll ever read in your life if you want to sort of understand economics, and not focus on the issue of the apodictic certainty aspects of Mises, but instead focus on the idea about open-endedness of choice. What are the preconditions for choice that Mises is making there? And what I want to suggest is that what Mises is postulating is that it's a rational actor model, but as if the choosers were human. That is, they're caught between alluring hopes and haunting fears. They're fallible but capable human choosers. All right, and that's a different sort of model than the lightning calculator of pleasure and pain. The second point is we've emphasized a lot about this role of institutional filters. But again, the institutions are not like just plopped from anywhere in the world. These institutions have to be as if history mattered. They are cultural constraints. They're not completely malleable. They're not completely rigid either. Okay, they adjust over time, but they can't be switched like a pair of underwear, right? These cultural institutions, in fact, serve as constraints. So what you're going to do is you're going to throw these individuals who are trying the best that they can in their given situation, but may err into an environment which is determined by their history and their culture, and what that generates is a set of processes, not a set of determined results. And what you have to do is you have to play the game. All right, you have to be able to play that game, and not to see the results. You don't just know that results. Think about it this way: bunting in baseball. All right, when to bunt and when not to bunt in a game of baseball is a function of the skill of the player, the position of the runners, all right, and also the inning that you're playing in, and the sort of score, right? It's only like if you just went up and just bunted randomly, that wouldn't be, like all that interesting, right? You wouldn't do that. What you would do is you bunt in the game of baseball when the context determines that that's a good time to bunt. Now, when does the game get interesting now? The other team knows that that's a good time for you to bunt, and then they respond. Now, how do you respond? Okay? So the only way that you can know the outcome of that game is to actually play the game. There's no determinate outcome of that. It's instead we can have a theory of baseball and a theory of the strategies, and so we have a coherent theory, a framework about how to do things, but we're not tied into or locked into a single exit model of an equilibrium. That's what liberty is about. Liberty is, in fact, an open-ended stream of choices. The freedom of choice can be summed up in the following sense. Man wants liberty to become the man he wants to become, right? You want to be able to be the architect of your own destiny, and that can only happen within certain institutional environments. That institutional environment is one of liberalism. Freedom of trade. It's not the freedom to trade with your friends or have your family networks or whatever. It's the trading with strangers. It's the cooperation and anonymity. It's when Milton Friedman in Free to Choose holds up the pencil and says to all of you, none of you can make this pencil. It's the mystery of that mundane production of the number 2 pencil, all right, and all the vast number of exchanges that required to be able to make that come about. That's what the freedom of trade is trying to do. How does that take place? It takes place within an environment, all right, in which strangers are allowed to become friends through the act of exchange, not through the act of face-to-face. But we become, in fact, trustworthy trading partners, not because we know one another, but because we trust the institutions within which we interact. And finally, I want to stress a point about the freedom of association, which goes back to my point about community. Remember what I said, the overarching vision is one of a society of free and responsible individuals who participate within a market economy based on profit and loss and who live in caring communities. We want to, in fact, live in communities that allow us to live better together, that, in fact, make us better human beings rather than worse human beings. And it's only when we have this ability, where we have compassionate communities, that we are going to be able to starve the state of the responsibilities for so much of the vagaries in life, and instead rely on our communities, our freedom of associations, our fraternal orders, our churches, our other nonprofit organizations, what Richard Cornell refers to as the independent sector. It's this independent sector, the vibrancy of civil society and commercial society, that is at the core of the science of liberty and what makes some societies not only more prosperous, but allow us to have greater and greater human flourishing. And it's in trying to understand the preconditions of that economics serves its best, sort of role as an intellectual discipline, being able to identify how the institutions of private property, freedom of prices, and accurate profit and loss accounting and all that's involved in doing that enables us to realize the great benefits of individual liberty and a peaceful coexistence. And I will stop at that and take as many questions as people would like to ask. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Boettke. We will do Q&A at this time, so please type in your questions into the question box. Our first question, says, since most of economics is driven towards policy creation, what is the role of an economist who believes that social order can be achieved without a state? Is he/she limited to only academia?
No, I mean, my last point that I just made about the independent sector, I think that's an extremely big challenge. So, for example, there's a guy up in New York that tried to get minorities interested in entrepreneurial activity, Steve Moriarty, and he got involved in teaching high school kids how to open up their own businesses and created this kind of nonprofit organization focusing on that. It's not about public policy. I don't think most economics is directed at public policy. I think a large segment of economics is directed at public policy. I do think that in a world where the government expects economists to do public policy, that the economist who refuses to do that and insists instead that he's just a student of society will in fact have to take a humbler role. But part of our role is also to serve as a social critic of those who have too much arrogance and think that they can in fact control their lives. But let's say that we live in a total libertarian world and there isn't anyone who is trying to be arrogant and control our lives. What role would economists, someone who's trained in economics, have other than teaching economics? They could also be active participants in developing and cultivating the independent sector. They could, in fact, devote their lives to their communities and being able to fill in the gaps when the natural vagaries of life happen. So they can be involved in their churches and they can explain how that's done. They can get people more involved in commerce by teaching them, how to get involved in their businesses and encouraging all of that. So I hope that answers your question. I think activism, starting your own private school, being an intellectual entrepreneur in the independent sector, start your own, way that you would have a homeschooling movement to get around the whole state school system. Simply, don't fight it, don't defeat the teachers union. Instead, just simply set up your own alternative network. Hello?
Okay, second question. Can you elaborate on the similarities between the development of social institutions and Hayek's idea of the law as opposed to legislation?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so the law, well, I mean, there's various different ways we can tackle this. One of them is the history of common law and why common law outperforms discretionary law of the, so judge-made law as opposed to legislator-made law, which is a big distinction in Hayek's idea. In this case, since we're talking about the evolution of social institutions, I simply want to make a distinction between rules in form and rules in function. So the rules of the game, all right, that are in operation, that evolve in operation. What matters is the rules in use, not the rules in form. And so it's not so much that what's written down on a piece of paper, but instead what people take to be what they agree with and what they're willing to acquiesce to in their interactions. So you might have, in like a Lynn Ostrom kind of situation, you might have communities that say that this property belongs to the community. So that would have the form of a communal property right. But when you look at the way Lynn describes how it is that that resource is protected, all right, the way it's protected is that they end up by having rules which limit access in the community. They assign accountability. And then there also is the sort of graduated penalties for those who violate. And violate the rules, all right? So they're going to be ostracized or they're going to, suffer some kind of graduated penalty. And if they have repeated violations, they eventually get completely kicked out. And so the question really becomes one of what are the rules in practice? Rather than those. And what Hayek is doing in the beginning part of Law, Legislation, and Liberty in the first book is he's laying out how it is that that kind of rules in practice become the basis for real law in society. The ultimate example of this, of course, is the common law, which is a more formal process of that. But you would also say that there's mores and norms and whatnot that evolve naturally to discipline and allow us to live better together. Hope that answered the question. That was a little long-winded. Sorry.
Okay, great. Third question. Where does empirical analysis fall in the scientific process for an Austrian economist?
Well, I think that this is a big question that a lot of people have gotten confused about. I think the first thing at a theoretical level, what you have to recognize is that we divide the spheres of knowledge within economics into 3 different branches. We start with pure theory. That's the pure logic of choice. And then we have economic history. All right? So you get a book like Mises called Theory and History. And so that's the first thing. So we have pure theory, and then we have economic history. Economic history can also be contemporary economic history, which we would call public policy, right, or contemporary economic history, which is, you know, what went on in the Reagan administration, what went on in the Clinton, right? That would be contemporary economic history, okay? So, but what people forget is that even in the Misesian system, there's a realm of economics, this goes all the way back especially to von Bavarick, in which you call, it's an institutionally contingent, or what I would call applied theory. That is economic theory that is then the pure logic of choice that is then placed within institutional frameworks which could be different, right? And that their difference is an empirical question. It's an empirical question whether or not a private property regime is in place or another kind of property rights regime is in place, okay? And so you have theory, applied theory, history, okay? Now, the only difference between, so an empirical informed part of analysis comes in even in theory, because you could in fact have a, you know, it's not you're testing the theory. What you're doing is testing the institutional assumptions. They could either be true or false about what kind of institutional regime you find yourself in. The difference between the Austrians and others is that we do not test our theories, all right? What we do is we see whether or not theories are applicable or inapplicable. The test of a theory is in its logic. Okay, so if you want to go back, what you would have to show is that the theoretical developments were illogical. There was a mistake in the logic. But it's not the empirics testing the theory. What the empirics do, especially this institutionally contingent aspect, is to determine whether or not a theory is applicable or inapplicable. Not all economic crises, for example, are generated by a boom and bust cycle caused by manipulation of money and credit. Okay? You could have some alternative theories of it. So the question you have to ask is whether or not the Austrian theory, right, what come to be known as the Austrian theory, is applicable or inapplicable. It's not that the Austrian theory is being tested to be proved to be wrong. It's whether or not it's applicable or inapplicable to that particular historical episode that you're trying to understand. It may, in fact, not be, or parts of it may not be, and then you have to change the story. So I hope that explains thing. The goal of the Austrian theory is not predictability, it's intelligibility. Can we render this phenomena intelligible in light of purposes and plans of individual human actors?
Okay, great. What are the most fruitful and promising topics in institutional analysis research for graduate and PhD students?
That's a great question. I mean, I think that you know, what we're doing right now, a lot of us here at George Mason, is we're examining questions of what are the hard cases for self-regulation. So think about environment. So in the standard theoretical results, you can get self-governance among small groups of homogeneous agents with low discount rates. Okay? So what we're doing to a large extent, and you can realize this by just looking at some of the topics that have been chosen, right? We're looking at large group settings of heterogeneous agents with high discount rates. And if you can show how they come up with mechanisms of self-regulation, even in environments which are most likely for that self-regulation to break down, then what you've identified is ways in which the self-regulation might be more robust than standard theory suggests. So that's an empirical project mixed with applied theory, trying to understand how it is you can produce social order without a state in environments. So you can look at pirates, you can look at criminals, you can look at all these different types of societies. And if we can get order out of those societies, then we might actually be able to get order out of other societies, like international trade and other kind of communities that sort of evolve that you don't necessarily need the state to do. However, I mean, that's just one slice of a topic. It's a very, it's one that fits well with Students for Liberty and people that are interested in libertarian society. But I also suggest, like right now, I think one of the big things that's missing is, the examination of the financial crisis. I mean, obviously, there's going to be a lot of things spilled, ink spilled about the financial crisis, but, a really good Austrian analysis at the level of sort of advanced economics could be very useful. George Selgin and Larry White and Steve Horowitz don't have a monopoly on that. Young people need to be going into that field as well and challenging their interpretation of things and taking their ideas and pushing them forward, taking Garrison's ideas and updating them and moving forward with it. It's a very exciting opportunity. Obviously, the field of development economics and the kind of work that Bill Easterly's doing and the work that we have there, and also failed in weak states. I mean, Chris Coyne is doing, outstanding work on the failure of war reconstruction and humanitarian aid efforts and all of this stuff. So I view that broad field of development economics as also an extremely vibrant field to work in.
Okay, so it looks like we're a little over time, but if it's okay with you, Dr. Boettke, we can either continue on to one or two more questions, or we can end it here, whatever works.
I can do 2 more questions.
Okay, great.
I have actually, we're out of time? Okay. Because I have, I can stay here as long as you want me to.
Okay. Why is the romantic view of pre-capitalist society so compelling when the reality of feudalism, slavery, etc. is so awful?
I mean, that's a, if I knew the answer to that, I wouldn't be staring at you on a computer screen, right? I'd be like, the most famous intellectual in the world. No, I mean, that's a big thing. It's just what Deirdre McCloskey's trying to grapple with in all of her works. Those books are big, chatty, huge books for a very good reason. She's taking on the entire clerisy. That's what she refers to it as, which is the intelligentsia, who has had this view. In my graduate class last week, we talked about Karl Marx, and we went through the whole thing with Karl Marx and Karl Marx's system. I teach a class in history of economic thought, modern economic thought, and I'm setting it up right now to talk about the socialist calculation debate. So we took a whole week to go over Marx's system. And, Marx's system is a coherent system built on a bunch of nonsense about how the world really works and interpretations about what was going on historically. So, McCloskey is trying to overturn that, but that staying power of that idea is something that's very romantic to all of us. And so, the easiest way to think about, these kind of ideas is that there was a, the way the dialectical materialism worked. The dialectic works is that you had to have a stage of primitive communism in which the social relations were desirable, but the economic relations were not very good. And then you had the sort of the antithesis in which what? Right? Where the economic relations were good, but the social relations were bad. And then what is the future supposed to hold for us? Okay, a world where we get both the economic relations and the social relations right. That's what the synthesis generates for us. And so that belief in a primitive communism that was somehow, hunky-dory and, the Indians all lived at one with nature and all these things like that, that's a very, very, hard image to get people to get out of their minds. And that's, one of the things really great historians have to keep hammering away at. Okay, so last question.
Okay. Is there a mainline monetary economics? If so, what role do Austrians play in it?
Mainline monetary economics, as opposed to, so Look, macroeconomics, monetary economics, I think, is a very important aspect of economics. Macroeconomics, as opposed to monetary theory, I think is a lot of made-up stuff. Okay, that doesn't always hold unless it's relative price economics. So the only economics is relative price economics. So as Roger Garrison likes to say, there may be macroeconomic problems, but there's only microeconomic solutions. Okay, and so that's different from money. So now let's think about money. I think there definitely is a main line of monetary theory. It goes all the way back to the Spanish scholastics and carries through from David Hume up through the quantity theory and into Mises, okay? And that is that there's monetary cranks who believe that you could double the money supply and nothing would happen to prices. And then there's the quantity theory, which says if you double the money supply, you're going to double the price level. The difference between the Austrians and other believers in that position is that it's not a mechanical interpretation. You double the money supply, you'll double the price level, but it's a process that goes through time. It's not like a helicopter dumps the money on the economy at one point in time and all the prices adjust proportionate instantaneously. Instead, it's more like spilling, throwing a pebble into the water and then having it ripple all the way through until it equals out. Or spilling a glass of water and then trying to pick it up with a napkin by putting the napkin first at the edge and watching it absorb its way through the economy. Okay? Now, once you get to that, then you start having problems of these Cantillon effects, which is that the relative prices, as they spread through the economy, cause distortions. So the bottom line in monetary economics, Austrian or whatever, doesn't matter, is that money is one half of all exchanges. If you screw around with money, you're going to screw around with exchanges, and you're going to generate economic distortions. Economics that violates or doesn't think that money has any kind of play in the economy because it's just a veil, that hides from view the impact that money can have on the system. Now, here's the other thing, and this I guess is how I'll end because it relates it back to the robustness. I have a paper with a colleague of mine, Dan Smith, who teaches at Troy University, and it's still in very beginning form, but it's trying to examine the monetary economics of Milton Friedman, F.A. Hayek, and Jim Buchanan. These are three of the most important classical liberal thinkers since the second half of the 20th century. And in each case, they constantly tried to understand how the monetary system operated and the role that government had in the monetary system. And they tried to figure out ways to discipline the government from distorting the monetary system. And in each case, they came up with their own solutions only to, in fact, become disillusioned by their previous efforts. So they're constantly, all the way through their long careers as political economists, trying to tie the ruler's hands when it comes to tie the monetary authorities' hands, only to recognize that their efforts at trying to tie the monetary authorities' hands have failed, and therefore they have to make another stab at the apple. So one of the ways to think about, of this is that Milton Friedman tried to come up with rules, rather than discretion. Jim Buchanan tried to take money out of the system and put it in the Constitution. And F.A. Hayek ended up by saying that we need to get government out of money altogether. In each of those cases, how they came to their position, they started with a position, basically shared position, about the nature of the quantity theory and what a good monetary authority should do under a central bank. And they became disillusioned with that over that time. Dan and I are trying to trace that out and explain what that would mean to have a robust theory of monetary institutions for today. So I think that there's a main line of economics. It very much is concerned, the main line of economics with regard to monetary economics, it's very concerned with the stability of the monetary unit and its ability to not be manipulated by third party, mainly government. All right, Adam Smith, and this is the last thing I'll say. So Adam Smith argued that all governments, ancient and modern, engage in a juggling trick. What they want to do is they want to run public debts. In Smith's time, it was for them to run entertainment for wars. It hasn't much changed, has it? So Adam Smith says that we want to run these public debts, right? And then what we're going to do is we're going to monetize those public debts. Rather than to pay them back, we're going to monetize them through debasing the currency. So you get a cycle of deficits, debts, and debasement of a currency. Smith refers to it as a juggling trick. How do I stop a juggler from juggling? I can either cut off its arms, tie its hands, or take the balls out of, take the balls away from him. Not juggling if you're just moving your hands up and down, right? So, but what I can't do is I can't leave the balls in the hands of a juggler and the juggler unconstrained and ask them to just simply stop juggling. That won't happen. And so what we need to do is we need to think through what the appropriate analogy is to tie the ruler's hands or to take the balls away or to eliminate the ability of the juggler to juggle. And what does that leave us with? It leaves us with a monetary unit, all right, that is not subject to political manipulation, especially by a monopoly supplier of that unit. And that's the key issue, I think. And that is not as radical of an idea in the main line of economics as it might seem if you only view economics from the point of view of the mainstream. So anyway, I appreciate very much Leah and the invitation to speak to you all. I hope that I was somewhat coherent, and keep up all the great work with the Students for Liberty, and you guys are a great force in our society and our higher institutions of higher education, and it was a great honor for me to get a chance to talk to you all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Boettke, and all of our participants this evening. I hope you can all continue coming back to our webinars to learn more throughout the year. Our next webinar is next Tuesday, September 27th at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. Ben Powell of Suffolk University will be discussing No Sweat, How Sweatshops Improve Lives and Economic Growth. To register, visit our website, studentsforliberty.org. On a final note, shortly you'll be emailed a follow-up email where you will find more detailed information about SFL and our next webinar. You'll also receive the PowerPoint slides and notes of Professor Boettke's talk, as well as a survey to evaluate the webinar. Please take a couple of minutes to fill it out. It helps us know how to improve our programs and make these webinars more interesting for you. And with that, I think we are officially wrapped up. Thank you again for your time this evening, and have a wonderful night, everyone.